The king of rock and roll wasn't supposed to die at 42. Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo who shook the world with his hips, voice, and charm, seemed larger than life. But on the morning of August 16, 1977, that illusion shattered forever. Found unconscious at his beloved Graceland estate, his sudden death stunned millions. Official statements spoke of a heart attack, but whispers began immediately, whispers of pills, of cover-ups, of a body pushed to the breaking point. For decades, the Presley family fought to keep the truth sealed away. But now, with the release of hidden autopsy files and testimonies, what really happened inside that Memphis morgue has finally come to light. And the truth isn't good. What doctors uncovered about Elvis's health, his lifestyle, and his final hours may forever change the way fans remember the man who defined an era. Elvis Presley's final day on Earth began like so many others in the last year of his life. Restless, weary, and cloaked in the haze of sleepless nights. At Graceland, the sprawling Memphis mansion that had become his fortress from the world, the king awoke in the late morning hours on August 16, 1977. He was only 42, yet years of relentless touring, failed relationships, and an ever-growing dependence on prescription drugs had aged him far beyond his years. Witnesses recalled that his skin had lost its glow, his weight fluctuated dramatically, and his once unshakable energy seemed to flicker in and out like a candle in the wind. He was due to fly to Portland, Maine, later that night to kick off another tour, but the truth was, Elvis's body was already failing him. That day he spent time with his fiancée, Ginger Alden, a young actress and model who had been living with him at Graceland. To the outside world, Ginger represented stability, a new chapter, a new love, but behind closed doors, she was watching a man unravel before her eyes. Elvis, plagued by insomnia, had developed a ritual of staying awake deep into the night, popping pills prescribed by a team of doctors who were more enablers than healers. These sleep cocktails were meant to quiet his racing mind, but they often left him groggy and unpredictable. Still, he pushed through, insisting he had obligations to his fans and an image to maintain. On that final day, Elvis played racquetball on the Graceland court with friends, laughing, sweating, and, for a fleeting moment, appearing like the vibrant man the world had adored. He even sang a few lines at the piano afterward, his voice still carrying a trace of its old magic, though the strength behind it had waned. To those around him, the mood seemed almost hopeful. He had been talking about marriage, about the future, about getting healthy. But as the sun set, his demons returned. That evening, Elvis complained of not being able to sleep. He told Ginger he was going to read in the bathroom, a habit she had seen many times before. With book in hand, he retreated into the solitude of that small space, perhaps seeking comfort, perhaps running from thoughts he couldn't silence. He told Ginger not to fall asleep until he returned, words that now carry an eerie finality. As the hours ticked past midnight, Elvis remained in the bathroom. The mansion was quiet, the sound of cicadas buzzing outside the windows, while the king of rock and roll wrestled with the weight of exhaustion and the cocktail of substances in his system. Around him, bottles of prescription pills littered counters and drawers, amphetamines, barbiturates, painkillers, and sedatives. Elvis had become reliant on these to function, though few could have predicted just how destructive this dependence had become. In the early morning hours, silence filled Graceland once again. Ginger dozed lightly, waiting for him to return. She would later recall that she drifted in and out of sleep, unaware that just a few feet away, history was taking a tragic turn. When she finally rose hours later and went to check, she would find Elvis lying motionless, face down on the floor of the bathroom, book still in hand. His final day had ended not with fanfare, not with a farewell performance, but with a quiet collapse that marked the end of an era. The king was gone, and the world would never be the same. Yet, in that moment, as the household scrambled and panic set in, no one truly understood what had caused his death. Only the autopsy files, locked away and whispered about for years, would tell the full story. And what they revealed was far darker than the simple explanation of a heart attack. It was just after 9 in the morning when Ginger Alden realized something was wrong. She had drifted in and out of light sleep through the night, waiting for Elvis to return from the bathroom as he had promised. But the hours stretched on, and the silence became unbearable. She called out softly at first, expecting him to answer, but there was no reply. With a growing sense of unease, she walked down the hall and pushed open the bathroom door, only to be met with the sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Elvis lay sprawled on the floor, his face pressed into the carpet, a book still clutched loosely in his hand. His body was motionless, his skin pale. And it was immediately clear that something terrible had happened. Ginger screamed for help, her voice echoing through the halls of Graceland. Within moments, the mansion erupted in chaos. Staff members rushed to the scene, some in disbelief, others already fearing the worst. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager and one of his closest friends, was among the first to arrive. He later described the surreal moment of seeing his boss, the man who had conquered the world, lifeless on the bathroom floor. They tried desperately to revive him, calling emergency services and attempting CPR, but the king's body gave no response. Paramedics arrived quickly, sirens blaring through the Memphis morning, and Graceland became the site of a frantic rescue attempt. Elvis was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital, but even as doctors worked frantically, the truth was already evident. The monitors showed no heartbeat, no pulse. The king of rock and roll had slipped away before anyone could save him. At 3:30 that afternoon, after repeated efforts to resuscitate him failed, Elvis Presley was officially pronounced dead. He was only 42. News of his death spread like wildfire. Radio stations broke into programming with urgent bulletins, television anchors struggled to hold back tears, and fans across the globe were plunged into shock. Outside Graceland, crowds began to gather within minutes, weeping openly, clutching records, photographs, and flowers. For millions, it felt impossible to imagine a world without Elvis. He had been a constant presence, an immortal figure, and yet here was the brutal truth. He was gone. But inside Baptist Memorial Hospital, another drama was beginning to unfold. The cause of Elvis's death was not immediately clear. The official announcement cited a massive heart attack, but whispers began almost instantly among staff and insiders. Elvis's body, once the image of youthful rebellion, now bore the signs of years of abuse, both physical and chemical. His abdomen was distended, his skin discolored, and his eyes glazed. To those who saw him, the explanation of a simple heart attack felt incomplete. The truth would not come from the hospital ward or the press release. It would come from the cold, sterile room where doctors prepared to open the king's body and record, in meticulous detail, the secrets it had been hiding. And as the gurney was wheeled into the morgue, the stage was set for one of the most controversial autopsies in American history. The body of Elvis Presley was transported to the morgue at Baptist Memorial Hospital, and what followed was an event steeped in secrecy, controversy, and suspicion. The world demanded answers, yet the people closest to Elvis seemed determined to control the narrative. Leading the procedure was Dr. Jerry Francisco, the Shelby County coroner, joined by a team of pathologists and medical examiners. The weight of the moment was undeniable. This was not just any autopsy. This was the autopsy of the most famous entertainer on the planet. A man adored by millions. A man whose death would be dissected as relentlessly as his life had been. Almost immediately, red flags appeared. Within hours of Elvis being declared dead, Dr. F.E. Prater Francisco released a statement to the press claiming that Elvis Presley had died of cardiac arrhythmia, essentially a heart attack. The declaration came so quickly that many questioned how he could possibly know before toxicology results or microscopic tissue studies were complete. It was as though the story had been decided before the scalpel even touched the skin. Inside the morgue, however, the reality was more complex. As the doctors began their work, they quickly realized that Elvis's body bore signs of extensive deterioration from years of abuse. His heart was enlarged, nearly twice the size of a normal man's, a telltale sign of long-term strain. His arteries showed narrowing consistent with advanced cardiovascular disease. His liver was scarred and damaged, pointing toward fatty liver disease or possible cirrhosis. And perhaps most shocking of all was the condition of his colon, which was impacted and stretched to nearly twice its size. A sign of chronic constipation linked to his prescription drug use and poor diet. These findings painted a picture of a man whose body had been fighting a losing battle long before that fateful morning. Yet the official word remained simple. Elvis had died of a heart problem, nothing more. Behind closed doors, however, murmurs spread among hospital staff and medical insiders that drugs had played a far greater role than anyone was willing to admit. The autopsy team had collected blood, urine, and tissue samples for toxicology testing, but results would take weeks, and by then, the initial headlines would have cemented the heart attack narrative in the public's mind. Many would later argue that Dr. Francisco's premature statement was no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to shield Elvis's legacy, to protect the Presley family, and perhaps to preserve the profitability of an empire that depended on the king's image remaining untarnished. The autopsy itself became the subject of intense scrutiny. Reporters camped outside the hospital, desperate for leaks. Fans speculated endlessly, some convinced that Elvis had been poisoned, others insisting that his drug use had been covered up. And inside that room, the doctors found themselves caught between science and myth, truth and protection. The files they compiled over the following days would be locked away, sealed from public view for decades, sparking endless conspiracy theories and feeding a mystery that only grew with time. Officially, the king had died of natural causes. Unofficially, the evidence suggested a far darker reality, that Elvis Presley's lifestyle, his dependency on pills, and the enabling of those around him had set his body on a path toward destruction long before the morning he collapsed at Graceland. The autopsy had begun, but the battle over his legacy had only just started. When the pathologists looked deeper into Elvis Presley's body, they were confronted with a shocking truth. The king of rock and roll had been living in a body that was crumbling from the inside out. To fans, Elvis was still the man who had electrified the world with his hips, his voice, and his swagger. But under the surface, he was carrying the scars of years of excess, addiction, and relentless pressure. His heart was one of the most disturbing discoveries. Weighing nearly twice the size of a normal heart, it revealed the toll of years of high blood pressure, poor diet, and drug use. Doctors noted that it wasn't just enlarged, it was straining, desperately trying to keep blood pumping through arteries narrowed by plaque. Elvis's cardiovascular system looked more like that of an old man in his 70s than a performer barely in his 40s, his liver told an equally grim story. Scarred and damaged. It bore signs of fatty liver disease and early cirrhosis. Decades of poor eating habits, fried foods, sugar-laden snacks, and midnight feasts of Southern comfort food had combined with prescription pills to attack his liver relentlessly. By 1977, the organ that filters toxins from the blood was itself toxic, swollen, and overworked, a silent warning that went unheeded. Then came the discovery that left even hardened examiners stunned. Elvis's colon, stretched and impacted. It was nearly twice its normal size, a grotesque indicator of chronic constipation, a condition he had battled for years. Caused by his dependence on barbiturates and opioids, which slow down the digestive system, Elvis's colon was so compromised that doctors believed it would have eventually ruptured had he lived longer. The bloating of his abdomen, the discomfort he often complained of, and even his fluctuating weight all pointed back to this overlooked but devastating condition. Elvis was literally carrying the weight of his own poison system inside him. Other findings added to the grim portrait. His body showed signs of long-term prescription drug use, opiates, barbiturates, and sedatives, all leaving their fingerprints in weakened organs, sluggish metabolism, and chemical imbalance. His lungs bore damage, possibly from years of smoking cigars and being surrounded by secondhand smoke. Even his skin, once radiant, had lost elasticity. A visual sign of the storm raging within. Forensic experts later admitted that Elvis's body appeared far older than 42. He may have been young in years, but physically, he was a man decades beyond his age. One examiner reportedly remarked that Elvis's body looked more like that of an exhausted old man than a global superstar. And yet, to the outside world, this information was never fully revealed at the time. Dr. Francisco's official statement kept things simple. Elvis had died of a heart problem. End of story. The shocking details of the autopsy, the grotesque reality of a body in ruin, were kept sealed, locked away in files and archives, hidden from the fans who idolized him. It was easier, perhaps, to let the world remember the image of Elvis in a jumpsuit, commanding the stage under the lights of Las Vegas, than to let them picture what the doctors had seen on that table. But those files remained. And when parts of them finally surfaced years later, they painted a devastating picture of a man who had been slowly dying long before that August morning. The king had built a legacy of power and glory, but his body told a different story, a story of fragility, decay, and the crushing cost of being Elvis Presley. While the world mourned and fans clung to the official statement that Elvis Presley had died of a heart attack, behind the scenes, another storm was brewing, one that would unravel the tidy explanation given to the public. Toxicology testing, the process of analyzing blood, urine, and tissue for traces of drugs, would take weeks to complete. But when the results came back, they exposed a disturbing truth. Elvis's system contained an alarming cocktail of prescription medications, enough to raise serious questions about how much his drug dependency had contributed to his death. The report revealed high levels of codeine, significantly above therapeutic range, as well as large amounts of Demerol, Quaaludes, Placidil, and Valium. Together, these substances created a lethal mix that depressed his central nervous system, slowed his breathing, and placed unbearable strain on his already enlarged heart. The toxicology results showed that Elvis was not simply a man with heart disease. He was a man whose body had been overwhelmed by years of chemical abuse. Yet even as these findings came to light, the truth was softened, manipulated, and in some cases, buried. Dr. Jerry Francisco continued to insist that drugs played no role in Elvis's death, stating that, the heart attack was the sole cause, a line repeated in news reports around the globe. But other doctors present at the autopsy strongly disagreed. They argued that the combination of barbiturates, opiates, and sedatives found in his system was more than enough to have caused respiratory failure, which in turn triggered cardiac arrest. The contradiction fueled a firestorm of speculation. Why would the official report dismiss the role of drugs when the toxicology evidence pointed directly to them? The answer, many believe, lay in the power of Elvis's image. In 1977, Presley wasn't just a man. He was a multi-million-dollar industry, with a catalog of records, movies, and merchandise that continued to generate enormous revenue even after his death. To admit that he had overdosed on prescription drugs would have stained his legacy, reduced his myth, and perhaps even damaged the financial empire that his estate depended upon. And so, the toxicology results were quietly downplayed, their damning details hidden in medical files and whispered about in hushed tones. Over time, insiders began to leak pieces of the truth. Former pathologists and medical examiners hinted in interviews that the drug levels were shocking. Some went as far as to say that Elvis's death was entirely preventable, and that it was only a matter of time before his body gave out under the strain of the chemicals he consumed daily. The controversy only deepened when portions of the toxicology files were sealed for decades, ordered closed to the public until the year 2027. This decision, reportedly at the request of the Presley family, added fuel to conspiracy theories. What were they hiding? Why did they not want the world to see the full truth? Some believed the family sought to protect Elvis's dignity, while others suspected darker motives, a cover-up of negligence by doctors, enablers, and those who profited from keeping Elvis on stage despite his deteriorating health. Whatever the reason, the toxicology controversy ensured that the story of Elvis Presley's death would never be simple. Officially, he died of a heart attack. Unofficially, the evidence showed that his heart stopped because his body was drowning in prescription drugs. The King's final performance wasn't on stage in Vegas or on television, it was in a morgue, where the clash between truth and myth played out in silence. The autopsy files didn't just reveal what killed Elvis. They revealed a system that allowed it to happen. A system built on money, fame, and denial. In the days after Elvis Presley's death, as grief-stricken fans flooded Memphis and the world reeled from the loss of its brightest star, another drama was quietly taking place behind the closed doors of Graceland and Shelby County. The Presley family, led by Elvis's father Vernon, faced a decision that would shape the legacy of the King for decades to come. What to do with the autopsy report, a document that laid bare the shocking details of his physical decline, his dependence on prescription drugs, and the grotesque state of his body? Vernon Presley, devastated by the loss of his only son, made a choice that raised eyebrows even then. He requested that large portions of the autopsy file be sealed, restricted from public view for 50 years until the year 2027. This unprecedented move immediately fueled suspicion. Families often protect the dignity of loved ones, but sealing a report for half a century sent a clear message. There were details inside that they did not want the world to know. Officially, the justification was to protect the family's privacy, to prevent sensational exploitation of Elvis's medical history. But many insiders and journalists saw it differently. They believed the Presley family, in collusion with local authorities, sought to bury the truth because it was too damaging to Elvis's myth, too humiliating for a man idolized as the embodiment of vitality, rebellion, and charm. The rumors grew louder when leaks from those close to the case suggested the files contained evidence of staggering drug levels, of organs ravaged by years of abuse, and of a colon so impacted it was nearly ready to rupture. These details, whispered in hushed conversations, painted a picture of a man whose death was not sudden or mysterious, but the inevitable outcome of years of neglect. The family's silence only made matters worse. As decades passed, fans clamored for answers. Books were written, documentaries filmed. Insiders came forward with fragments of the truth, but the sealed files remained the ultimate forbidden treasure. What was so damaging that it had to be hidden until most of his generation of fans would be gone? The Presley estate, meanwhile, transformed Elvis into a larger-than-life brand, turning Graceland into a shrine that drew millions of visitors. His image was carefully managed, young, vibrant, commanding the stage, while the darker truth of his final years was pushed aside. But those who had been close to Elvis knew the reality. They knew of the midnight trips to doctors, the suitcases full of pills on tour, the bloated figures struggling to make it through a performance, and the endless enabling by those who profited from keeping him working. For them, the autopsy files were not just medical records. They were proof of a life consumed by excess and exploitation. Even today, with much of the information leaked or revealed through secondary sources, the sealed files remain a symbol of the family's desperate attempt to protect not only Elvis's dignity, but also the empire built on his name. As 2027 approaches, fans and historians wait with bated breath, wondering what final revelations those hidden documents will bring. And yet, even without full disclosure, the pattern is clear. The Presley family chose silence over transparency, control over truth. By sealing the files, they didn't stop speculation. They ignited it. They ensured that Elvis's death would never be seen as a simple tragedy, but as a mystery, a puzzle with missing pieces, a story wrapped in secrecy that continues to haunt the world nearly half a century later. For years after Elvis Presley's death, the official narrative remained locked in place. He had died of a heart attack. End of story. But as time passed, medical experts who had studied the autopsy, reviewed the toxicology, or even been present in Memphis that week, began to contradict the official line. Some were blunt, others careful, but the message was the same. Elvis did not simply die of a bad heart. He died because his body was overwhelmed by prescription drugs and neglect. One of the first to break ranks was Dr. Cyril Wecht, a prominent forensic pathologist who reviewed the files. He pointed out that the levels of codeine in Elvis's system were toxic, and that multiple other sedatives were present at dangerous concentrations. To Wecht, it was obvious. Elvis had died of a drug-induced respiratory failure that caused his heart to stop. He accused local officials of protecting Elvis's reputation rather than telling the truth. Others echoed his concerns. Dr. Nicopolis, Elvis's longtime physician, nicknamed Dr. Nick, came under scrutiny for prescribing thousands of pills to Elvis in the months leading up to his death. In one 9-month span alone, Elvis received more than 10,000 doses of amphetamines, barbiturates, and narcotics. While Dr. Nick insisted he was trying to manage Elvis's many ailments, critics argued he had enabled a deadly addiction. Medical insiders later admitted that Elvis's lifestyle and pill consumption had been an open secret in Memphis. Everyone around him knew, but no one stopped it. As these voices grew louder, the heart attack narrative crumbled. The autopsy files, when partially revealed, supported the experts' claims. Elvis's organs showed damage consistent with long-term drug abuse, and his colon and liver pointed to chronic conditions that his prescriptions only worsened. By the 1990s, it was no longer controversial among medical professionals to say that Elvis's death had been drug-related. yet the official record remained unchanged, a testament to the power of myth over fact. For fans, this was painful to hear. To think that the king's death was preventable, that doctors and enablers stood by while he destroyed himself, was a tragedy greater than any ballad he ever sang. Medical experts had spoken, and their verdict was clear. Elvis didn't just die, he was failed by medicine, by those around him, and by the fame that demanded he keep performing until his body could take no more. The autopsy files of Elvis Presley reveal more than just the condition of a body. They tell the story of a man consumed by his own legend. On the surface, he was the king of rock and roll, adored by millions, his voice immortal, his image stamped on every corner of American culture. But beneath the sequined jumpsuits and bright lights, he was a man trapped by the pressures of fame, a man who leaned on prescription drugs to keep going, and a man whose own body became the battlefield where excess and neglect waged war. His death at 42 was not simply a tragedy of timing, it was a warning about what happens when humanity is sacrificed for stardom. The files, sealed for decades, show the cost of a life lived at full throttle without pause. An enlarged heart, scarred liver, and impacted colon were not just medical notes. They were evidence of years of abuse hidden behind the curtain of Graceland. For fans, the release of these details was devastating, yet also clarifying. It stripped away the myth of invincibility and reminded the world that Elvis was human, vulnerable, and in many ways broken long before August 16, 1977. Yet in death, as in life, Elvis remained larger than life. Graceland became a pilgrimage site. His records continued to sell, and his image remained frozen in youth and power, untouched by the grim reality of his decline. The autopsy files may tarnish the pristine image, but they also give a fuller picture of the man behind the myth. They show us that Elvis was not destroyed by one moment, but by years of choices, pressures, and enablers who never forced him to stop. His death was preventable, his suffering unnecessary. But his story is now immortal. As the world edges closer to the year 2027, when the final sealed files are scheduled to be opened, fans and historians wait to see what other truths will emerge. Will they confirm what experts have long suspected? Or will they reveal new horrors that even now remain hidden? One thing is certain. The king may be gone, but the fascination with his life, his death, and his legacy will never fade. Elvis Presley's autopsy files are not just medical documents. They are the final verses of a song that ended too soon, a song that reminds us that legends are still mortal, and that even kings can fall.